Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive into the world of semiconductors. More specifically, Taiwan's dominance in this industry. We talk about how crucial these tiny chips are, right? Well, they're not just in our phones and computers anymore. No, we're talking cars, refrigerators, medical equipment. I mean, you name it. And today we're going to explore what happens, if that supply is disrupted and what's at stake, not just for the global economy, even for national security.
Yeah. It's true. These tiny pieces of silicon are pretty much holding our modern world together.
So how big of a player is Taiwan when it comes to semiconductors? I mean, what makes them so special?
Well, to understand that, you really have to look at the numbers. So in 2024, Taiwan's semiconductor industry produced an incredible $138 billion worth of chips. That's a huge chunk, 18% of their entire GDP. And it's not just about the money. Think about it. If something happened to Taiwan's chip production, like a natural disaster or political instability, anything like that, poof, like instantly wiping out a huge part of their economy. And since they supply such a massive portion of the world's chips, I mean, the ripple effects would be global.
So they're not just making chips, they're like holding up the global tech ecosystem.
Exactly. Now, a big reason for Taiwan's dominance is this company called TSMC. It stands for Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. They're the world's largest contract chip maker, especially for those really advanced, tiny chips that go into all the latest gadgets and AI systems.
Right.
For every dollar that TSMC earns, 74 cents goes right back into the Taiwanese economy. I mean, we're talking suppliers, jobs, the whole shebang. It really shows just how intertwined TSMC is with their overall well-being.
Okay, so TSMC is like the heart of this whole operation. But I've also been hearing about these semiconductor wars, between the U.S. and China. Where does that fit in?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Both the U.S. and China have kind of woken up to the fact that semiconductors aren't just about economics anymore. They're a strategic asset, almost like a weapon, in the 21st century. And they both really want to be the ones holding that weapon.
So it's like a high-stakes chess game with Taiwan right in the middle.
Exactly. On one side, you have the U.S. Trying to reduce their reliance on Taiwan and bring chip manufacturing back home. They've got this Sheet GPS Act that's pouring billions of dollars into building these new factories, which are called fabs, by the way.
Oh, that's good to know. I always wondered what a fab was.
Right. It stands for fabrication plant, and it's basically where those chips are made, a very complex and expensive process. Anyway, the U.S. is trying to incentivize companies to build these fabs on U.S. soil.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're talking about tariffs on chips that come from China, trying to discourage companies from investing there.
So it's like a two-pronged approach. Boost their own production, try and limit China's.
Exactly. Now, on the other side of the board, you've got China pushing for what they call semiconductor sovereignty. They want to be completely self-sufficient when it comes to chips. They're investing massive amounts of money into research and development, and they're definitely not shy about using pretty aggressive tactics, like undercutting Taiwanese fabs on price to grab market share.
Wow, so they're playing hardball. But Taiwan must have some advantages, right? They've been the leader for so long. I mean, they got to have some tricks up their sleeve.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when it comes to those really advanced chips, the ones smaller than 7 nanometers. Taiwan is way ahead. They have the technology, the expertise, the whole package. And even if other countries manage to catch up, in terms of production, there's another layer to this. It's the packaging technology.
Packaging. Is that like putting the chips into those little black boxes we see on circuit boards?
Well, sort of, but it's way more sophisticated than that. It's all about how those tiny chips are connected to the rest of the device. And Taiwan has got this crazy advanced packaging technology, so advanced that they handle, something like 90% of the packaging for those powerful GPUs, the graphics cards that are crucial for things like AI. Imagine trying to replace that level of expertise. It won't be easy for anyone.
So even if other countries throw tons of money at this, catching up to Taiwan, it's not going to happen overnight. But what about the potential chaos if Taiwan's production was disrupted? What would happen to the world?
Well, imagine a world where 40% of all electronics production just stops, like almost overnight. Tech stocks would plummet, wiping trillions of dollars off the market. And it's not just tech that would suffer. Think about the auto industry. Those cars we drive, especially the electric ones, they need thousands of chips to function.
Right.
A major chip shortage could literally bring the entire industry to its knees.
That sounds like a recipe for global economic disaster.
It really does. And the scariest part is there are no quick fixes in this industry. Making those specialized machines that are needed to produce chips, it takes a really long time. I mean, we're talking 18 months or more. Even if countries started investing heavily tomorrow, it would take years to fill that gap that Taiwan would leave behind.
Okay, so we've got the U.S. and China vying for dominance in this chip race, and Taiwan holding the crown but facing some serious external pressure. What are the challenges from within? Are there any cracks in their armor?
You know, it's interesting. Some of the biggest threats to Taiwan's chip supremacy are actually coming from inside their own borders.
So we talked about how crucial Taiwan is, to the global chip supply, and how the U.S. and China are both kind of making their moves in this whole semiconductor game. But what about Taiwan itself? I mean, what challenges are they facing internally that could really shake things up?
Well, one of the biggest issues is this growing labor shortage. Right now, there are something like 35,000 engineering jobs in Taiwan's chip industry that they just can't fill. And we're not talking about just any engineering job. These are really specialized roles that require years of training and experience.
So even with all that money flowing through the industry, they're struggling to find enough qualified people. Why is that?
It's a combination of factors, really. Taiwan's birth rate is pretty low, which means there aren't as many young people entering the workforce. Plus, the work itself is incredibly demanding. Long hours, high pressure, constantly having to keep up with all the latest advancements. It's not for everyone.
Yeah, I can see how that would make it hard to attract and keep talent, especially when other countries are trying to poach their best engineers.
Exactly, and that's another problem for Taiwan brain drain. As countries like the U.S. ramp up their own chip production, they're offering big salaries and attractive working conditions to lure, experienced engineers away from Taiwan. In fact, almost a quarter of the staff at that huge new TSMC plant in Arizona, they're engineers who transferred from Taiwan.
So it's like a double whammy. Not enough new talent coming in and experienced talent being lured away. What else is adding to the pressure?
Well, there's also the issue of energy. Chip fabrication requires a massive amount of electricity. Right now, a quarter of Taiwan's entire energy supply goes to powering those fabs.
Wow.
And as global demand for chips keeps going up, that energy demand is only going to increase.
Wow. It's a lot of juice for one industry. Are they able to keep up?
It's a constant struggle, to be honest. They're investing in renewable energy and trying to make those fabs more energy efficient, but it's a race against time.
Okay, so we've got labor shortages, brain drain energy constraints, all kind of putting pressure on Taiwan from within. What can they do to address these challenges? Are there any strategies in the works?
Well, one idea is to kind of play to their strengths, so to speak. Taiwan is known for its cutting-edge chips, the most advanced in the world. But not everything needs that level of sophistication. Like, think about it. Your smart refrigerator doesn't need a 3-nanometer chip. A 45-nanometer chip, which is much easier and cheaper to produce, would work perfectly fine. So focusing on those less advanced chips, for certain industries, could help take some of that pressure off their resources.
Right, so it's about choosing their battles and finding those areas where they have a clear advantage. Are there any other potential solutions being discussed?
Well, Taiwan is very aware that to stay ahead, they can't just sit still. Innovation is key, and that means investing heavily in research and development, specifically in those areas where they can maintain a technological edge. And to incentivize companies to keep pushing the boundaries, the government is considering some pretty big tax breaks. I mean, as much as 10% for companies that invest in chip innovation.
That's a pretty significant incentive. I've also heard some buzz about automation and AI playing a bigger role in chip manufacturing. Could that help with things like the labor shortage?
It's definitely an area that holds a lot of promise. TSMC, for example, has developed this new chip packaging technology called CoWoS. It stands for chip-on-wafer-on-substrate. It's this super complex process where they stack multiple chips together in a really compact way. And the cool thing is it already uses 40% less human labor than traditional methods.
Wow, so they're finding ways to not just replace workers with robots, but to actually make the whole manufacturing process smarter and more efficient.
Exactly. And AI is playing a big role in that. Algorithms are being used to optimize chip designs, fine-tune production processes, and even predict and prevent defects before they happen.
Okay, so Taiwan is facing some serious internal challenges, but they're also working on some pretty creative solutions. But what about those what-if scenarios we talked about? Like, what if the whole foundation of chip manufacturing changes? What if we can just print chips like we print documents?
That's where things get really interesting. Imagine a world where you can print chips using 3D printing technology and advanced materials like graphene.
3D printing chips. That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie. Is that even possible?
It's definitely further out on the horizon, but researchers are making some exciting progress. The idea is to essentially print chips layer by layer using a special kind of ink made from materials like graphene.
Graphene, that's the super thin, super strong material, right?
Exactly. Graphene has some mind-blowing properties that make it ideal for this. It's incredibly strong and conducts electricity even better than copper, yet it's only 1 atom thick.
Okay, so it's strong, conductive, and thin, perfect for making those tiny chips.
Yeah.
But how would that change the game? I mean, would we even need these massive fabs anymore?
That's the big question. 3D printing could potentially revolutionize the whole industry. It could dramatically reduce the cost and complexity of making chips. It could also open up totally new possibilities for chip design, allowing for more flexible and customized chips. Imagine being able to print a chip tailored for a specific application right there on the spot.
That would be a game changer. Suddenly, it's not just a few big companies controlling the chip supply. Anyone with a 3D printer and the right materials could potentially make their own chips.
Exactly. It could democratize the whole industry, giving smaller companies and even individuals the power to design and manufacture their own chips.
Wow, that's a pretty radical shift. But even if that's down the road, are there any other potential game changers we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, there's also the rise of new players in the semiconductor game. We focused a lot on Taiwan, the US, and China, but don't underestimate the potential of countries like India.
India. I hadn't really thought of them as a major player in the chip world.
They're not yet, but they have the potential to become a force to be reckoned with. India's got this huge and rapidly growing tech sector, and they're investing heavily in semiconductor research and development. Plus, they have this massive advantage when it comes to labor costs, which could allow them to really undercut the existing players on price.
So they could shake things up just by being able to offer cheaper chips.
It's certainly a possibility, and they're not starting from scratch. India already has some experience in chip manufacturing, although mostly in the less advanced 28-nanometer range.
Right, so they're not quite at the cutting edge yet. But could they realistically leapfrog to the top to compete with the likes of TSMC?
It's definitely a long shot, but not entirely impossible. It would take massive investments, strategic partnerships, and a lot of focused effort to attract top talent and build the necessary infrastructure. But if India can pull it off, it would have a significant impact on the global semiconductor landscape. Imagine a world where chip manufacturing isn't concentrated in just a few locations, but spread across multiple countries with different strengths and capabilities.
That would definitely shake things up.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got potential disruptors like 3D printing and new players like India entering the scene. What does all of this mean for Taiwan? Could they actually lose their crown as the king of chips?
In the world of technology, nothing stays the same for very long. The semiconductor industry is incredibly dynamic and things can change really quickly. Taiwan can't just sit back and expect to stay on top forever. They need to keep pushing the boundaries, investing in new technologies, and maybe even looking beyond chip manufacturing to find new ways to leverage their expertise.
It's like they're running a marathon, but the finish line keeps moving further away. So they need to be adaptable and strategic to maintain their lead.
Absolutely. One key area they're focusing on is talent development. We talked earlier about that labor shortage they're facing. They need to find ways to attract and nurture top engineering talent, both from within Taiwan and by attracting the best minds from around the world.
So it's not just about technology, it's about people. Investing in education training and creating a work environment that attracts the best and brightest.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the role of the government. The Taiwanese government has been incredibly supportive of the semiconductor industry, but they need to keep adapting their policies and strategies to keep pace with this rapidly evolving global landscape. Think tax incentives, investments in infrastructure, streamlining regulations, all those things play a role.
Okay, so it's a combination of private sector innovation and smart government policies that will determine Taiwan's future in this industry. But let's not forget about the elephant in the room. We talked about these semiconductor wars between the US and China. How is that geopolitical tug-of-war going to play out in the years to come? I mean, what are the potential risks, opportunities for Taiwan?
Well, that's a topic that deserves its own deep dive. It's a complex situation with a lot of moving pieces, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Taiwan's chip supremacy, and things are getting pretty intense. We've talked about the economics, the internal pressures, on Taiwan, and even some potential disruptions out there on the horizon. But now let's really get into this geopolitical chess match that's happening around semiconductors. You mentioned semiconductor wars earlier. Could you give us a clearer picture of what's going on? Like, who are the main players and what are they after?
Well, as we've been saying, it's basically a power struggle between the US and China, with Taiwan caught right in the middle. Both countries see semiconductors as totally essential, not just for the economic reasons, but for national security as well.
Okay, so let's break it down, starting with the U.S. What's their game plan in this whole chip showdown?
Well, the US has kind of had a wake-up call, realizing just how much they depend on Taiwan for those really advanced chips. And, with the rising tension with China, that reliance is starting to look like a real vulnerability.
Right? It's like they built their whole tech dominance on something that could just crumble. So what are they doing about it?
Their main strategy is to try and bring chip manufacturing back to the U.S., what they call reshoring. Remember that ChipX Act we talked about? That's a big part of it. They're pouring billions of dollars into incentivizing companies to build those super expensive fabs right here in the U.S. And it's not just carrots. They're using some sticks, too.
Oh, you mean like those tariffs on chips coming from China?
Exactly. They're trying to make it less attractive for companies to rely on China for their chips, both to protect their own interests and try and slow down China's growth.
It's a pretty aggressive approach, but I guess they see it as a matter of national security. Now, what about China? What are they hoping for when it comes to chips?
China is playing for even bigger stakes. Their goal is nothing less than semiconductor sovereignty, the ability to design and manufacture all the chips they need without depending on anyone else. It's a pretty bold vision.
Wow, that is a big goal. Why is that so important to them?
Well, it's not just about the economics, even though they definitely see semiconductors as, the key to becoming a global tech superpower. They want to control those industries of the future, artificial intelligence, 5G, quantum computing, and they know that takes a strong independent chip industry.
Right, so it's about controlling their own destiny in the tech world.
Yeah.
But there's also that national security side of it too, right? Not wanting to depend on potential enemies for something so important.
Absolutely. China's really aware of how much they depend on foreign companies, particularly American ones, for the chips that go into their military equipment. They don't want to find themselves in a situation where their whole military could be crippled because someone else is controlling the chips.
So it's a mix of economic ambition and that desire for self-reliance. But can they actually do it? Can China really catch up to the U.S. and Taiwan in this crazy, complex, technologically challenging industry?
It's a massive task, no doubt about that. But they're making some serious moves. They're investing tons of resources into research and development, attracting top talent from all over the world, and building up their own domestic chip manufacturing.
But they got to be hitting some roadblocks along the way, right?
Oh, for sure. One of the biggest hurdles is that technology gap. The US and Taiwan are still ahead when it comes to those really cutting-edge chip fabrication techniques. And then there are those export controls that limit China's access to certain key technologies. It's not just about spending money. They need to overcome some pretty fundamental technological barriers.
So what are they doing to close that gap? Are they playing by the rules, or are they getting a little creative?
Well, let's just say they're using every tool in the toolbox. They're investing in their own research and development, trying to acquire foreign technology through partnerships and acquisitions, and even resorting to some, less ethical tactics like industrial espionage.
Sounds like a Wild West out there. With all this tension and, maneuvering between the U.S. and China, where does that leave Taiwan? They're holding all the cards, but stuck between these two giants.
Taiwan's in a tricky spot, that's for sure. They're the world leader in chip manufacturing, but they're also really vulnerable both geographically and politically. It's a real balancing act, trying to keep good relationships with both the US and China while looking out for their own interests.
It's like playing poker with two superpowers. What are their choices? How do they handle this without getting crushed?
Their current strategy is to basically play both sides, which is a very delicate dance. They're working with the U.S. on things like the CHEPS Act, building fabs in Arizona, even sharing some technology. But they're also trying really hard to maintain those economic ties with China since, China's still their biggest trading partner.
So it's a don't rock the boat strategy. But can they keep that up forever? What happens if things get worse and they're forced to pick a side?
That's the worst case scenario for Taiwan. They absolutely do not want to have to make that choice. Their hope is to maintain what's called strategic ambiguity. That ability to keep everyone guessing and not commit fully to one side or the other.
But that seems so risky. What happens if that balancing act fails? What are the potential consequences of this semiconductor war actually getting out of control?
Well, the absolute worst case scenario is a military conflict over Taiwan. And if that were to happen, It would be a disaster on a global scale. And I don't just mean the human cost, which would be horrible. Think about the economic fallout. The whole global supply chain for semiconductors would be destroyed, and the effects would be felt everywhere.
So it's not just about who controls Taiwan, it's about a potential global economic meltdown.
Exactly. We're talking about a world where, smartphones, computers, cars, even basic appliances become really scarce or even disappear. Our whole modern tech-dependent way of life could just start to fall apart.
That's a pretty grim picture. So what can we do to stop that from happening? Is there any hope for a peaceful solution?
Well, it's a complicated problem that needs some serious diplomacy. World leaders and policymakers need to find ways to de-escalate things, build some trust, and create a more stable and predictable environment. It's a tall order, but the stakes are just too high to ignore.
So what are some things that could actually be done? How do we move away from all this, brinkmanship and towards a more collaborative way of doing things?
One really important step is better communication and dialogue between the U.S. and China. They need to understand each other's perspectives and concerns, even if they don't agree on everything. Finding some areas where they can work together, even if it's just small steps, could help build some of that trust that's so badly needed.
Right. So it's about finding common ground, even with all that rivalry. What else could help?
Another important step is diversifying the global supply chain for chips. Right now, there's too much focus on Taiwan, which makes the whole system vulnerable. Encouraging chip production in other places, like the US, India, even Europe, would create a more balanced and resilient system.
So it's about spreading the risk, making sure we don't have all our eggs in one basket. Are there any other options being considered?
Well, some experts have talked about international agreements or treaties that would guarantee the free flow of semiconductors, even when there's geopolitical tension. It's a long shot since it would take a lot of trust and cooperation between countries that don't always get along. But it could be a powerful way to stop a chip war from happening.
So it's a complex web of interconnected challenges with no easy answers. But it's clear that the stakes are incredibly high, and finding ways to coexist peacefully in this new era of chip supremacy is absolutely essential. It's not just about economic power or national security, it's about the well-being of the entire planet.
Well said. This isn't just some game for governments and corporations. The choices they make affect all of us.
That's a powerful message to leave our listeners with. We've covered a lot today exploring this intricate world of Taiwan's chip supremacy. From the economics of making chips to those really complex geopolitical tensions that are shaping this whole industry. I hope this has given you a better understanding of this crucial and constantly evolving topic.
It's been a really interesting conversation, and I think we've shed some light on a lot of different aspects of this complex issue.
Remember, the world of semiconductors is always changing. New technologies pop up, new players enter the game, and the global landscape is never standing still. It's a story that's still unfolding, and it's one that will have a huge impact on all of us. So stay curious, keep learning, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Yes. And maybe the most important question to ask yourself is, what role do you want to play in shaping this technological revolution?
That's a great question to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration of the world around us.